Okay, this is our program for the week of January 27th, 2025. At the end of last week's program, we talked about taking a closer look at the humanitarian aid situation in Gaza, report surveying a range of organizations working on the ground in Gaza was released this week. And thank you to our comrade Maha for sending this report along. I've dropped a link to it in the chat, which you can follow to take a look at it. Its findings aren't surprising. The Israeli military repeatedly flouted the ICJ's ruling to ensure the safe delivery of necessary aid. And surveyed organizations reported that 94% of aid workers had been displaced at least once, many multiple times. 72% of aid agencies reported that their premises were damaged due to air or ground attacks by Israeli forces at least once since January 2024, with many reporting multiple attacks. And 93% of aid agencies were forcibly relocated at least once since the ICJ ruling, mainly due to Israeli displacement orders and military offensives. And in addition, essential items like PPE, winterization supplies, food, educational materials were all denied on a regular basis due to, as Samer has talked about numerous times, the dual-use procedure rule, which is Israel's way of saying that something can be used militarily and thus could not be brought into Gaza. Um, these findings, again, are not surprising, and um, they detail Israeli policies and practices that sabotage the efforts of humanitarian workers throughout the last year. And of course, one could surmise from this report and our coverage over the last year that cruelty is the point. And indeed, Israeli politicians from Netanyahu to the more rabid Smotrich and Ben-Gvir have certainly given every indication that their animus for Palestinians has no limits. I think this animus resonates with what we've seen from the second MAGA administration over its first 2 weeks. The freezing of $3 trillion in federal grants this week that support essential services and social welfare benefiting poor and working class people, including and especially for MAGA, the Black and brown communities, transgender people, and women it targets most acutely, was and is unabashedly about cruelty. Just like the administration's actions and separate executive orders that froze foreign aid. And of course, that isn't the kind of military aid to Israel or other imperialist partners. It's humanitarian aid affecting things like necessary maternal health and mental health services to millions of women in places like Afghanistan, Pakistan, Ukraine, and of course, Gaza. Um, Samer, there's an article that was published just this morning by the New York Times. I will also try to drop that in the chat that gets into a little bit of the scope and scale of how far the disruption of aid has already gone and just how many people are already affected and will be affected as the Trump administration obviously will continue to push for freezes on foreign aid. This is the immiseration of millions of people worldwide and death due to lack of basic medical care. The New York Times posits this is a very real outcome for hundreds of thousands of people in the near future when programs that provide, for example, vital HIV and AIDS prevention in places like Haiti are gutted. And this is, of course, the problem inherent to a global capitalist economy in which forced dependencies on foreign aid, particularly U.S. aid, have made everyday survival so utterly precarious for so many. But I want to turn to you before you get started. Someone who knows a bit about and has worked around this infrastructure of foreign aid, to ask you if you could maybe situate us a little bit in the scope and scale of the impacts of this funding freeze, your reactions to hearing about that executive order, especially as we are, in this critical, what we expect to be some interstitial period of a ceasefire in Gaza, where we're expecting that things will be ratcheted up at some point when Trump and Netanyahu decide to take things, up a notch again with their military offensive. So, yeah, I'm curious what your reactions were, and if you can also situate us a little bit in like what this means for global aid and also for Gaza itself.
Yeah, thanks, Thomas. There's a lot there, and it's hard to overstate the impact of that foreign aid freeze. Like the extent to which uh, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people that are relying on that aid are suddenly finding it with absolutely no warning, completely cut off. It's tough because I think the aid that the United States provides, like, I worked in international humanitarian aid for years. It's gross, right? Like it's gross in a lot of different ways. It's always sort of designed to foster the sense of dependence, right? It comes with a series of imperial or colonial ambitions in the ways that it sort of projects power or builds, forces or whatever. It's in many ways, right? It's the velvet glove on the iron fist of colonialism. And so like I don't think any of us are big fans of US aid and the ways that it's distributed and how it's used generally. And at the same time, in its absence, right? In its absence, there are real world consequences for many, many people who have been unfortunately, right, for reasons that are frankly in many ways due to the United States, highly dependent on the sort of humanitarian support, the sort of like AIDS rollback kind of things. PEPFAR in Africa in particular is, I think, a key example. And you know, a lot of the stuff is paused temporarily. Ostensibly the Trump administration is doing a review of all the foreign aid, and some of it is going to get turned back on. But it's very clear that the things that don't jive with the sort of MAGA agenda are not coming back, right? And not coming back for years. And that includes a lot of really critical life-sustaining support to developing countries that I don't think we're going to see anytime soon. And the U.S., for all of its sort of like isolationism and whatever, is a massive donor in the humanitarian uh, like ecosystem, a massive, massive donor. So the loss is quite big. Yeah, I think its implications in Gaza are also very clear, and also extremely telling that literally all foreign aid was frozen with the exception of Israel and Egypt, right? Like the two countries that will continue to receive everything that they were receiving. But that doesn't include the stuff that's going to Palestine, right? A lot of that did get frozen, in fact. And even now, what we're seeing is, despite this big humanitarian aid surge in Gaza during the ceasefire, uh, things that can actually get beyond this cycle of dependency are not, in fact, being allowed in. So, for example, there was an expectation and I believe an agreement within the ceasefire, and we'll get to this, that materials for longer term sustainability, so not like concrete to build new buildings, but even just like longer term tents and things like that that allow people, they've been living in these temporary shelters for so long, were supposed to be let in during the ceasefire and they're not being let in. So it's a similar sort of aid freeze happening, from the US and its colonial ally, that is designed in very similar ways to sort of like, the cruelty is the point sort of thing to inflict a sort of massive scale of, uh, just disrupting the ways that the world works.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that insight. I do think it's also the chaos is the point as well, right? And I think I think everybody here who's on this call knows that this has been quite the chaotic week here in the U.S. Last 2 weeks. And some of what the Times report and some of the other reports on the impact of this foreign aid freeze are already indicating is the kind of turmoil and chaos that is throwing that entire sector into. But we also have a lot to report here. I know you have to get into it, including some very sharp attacks and very real attacks on the Palestine Solidarity Movement this week, vis-a-vis the order around visas and the revocation of visas for folks that have engaged in Palestine solidarity work. So looking forward to your report. Again, it's a sobering period. It's great to have everybody join us. And yeah, thanks for you for being with us again.
Thanks, Thomas. Sobering indeed and exhausting. I can't believe it hasn't even been 2 weeks of the Trump presidency. It feels like it's been my whole life. Yeah, we got to buckle up. It's going to be a long 4 years at least. So jumping right in, I want to highlight in this overview page that we've been doing for a year and a half now, the lowest increase in the death toll that we've reported thus far. So that's nice for once, and then like a sort of mixed feeling of some elation at the fact that the official death toll only went up by about 70 in the past week. And then the sort of rebound feeling of like, can we feel joy about 70 people being murdered by the Israelis this week. Some of them are bodies that have been recovered, but others are Israel violating the ceasefire agreement in a number of ways that we'll discuss in more detail. But getting into that ceasefire agreement, which, at this point is now really in full effect, uh, what we saw, this week was a number of moments in which the ceasefire really teetered on a knife's edge. We got fairly close to situations where it seemed like things could collapse. One in particular around this issue with um, Arbel Yahud, the person that we actually talked about last week, that, Hamas was supposed to release a number of prisoners. One of them was meant to include this person, one of the last remaining women that are being held that is not an IDF soldier. And despite the fact that Hamas was not holding this person, she was being held by Islamic Jihad, um, Israel held Hamas responsible for her not being released that last Sunday. And if you remember, we talked about it last Friday, for those of you who joined us last week, and talked about how the Israelis said they were expecting her to be there, but it was okay that she wasn't. And they were like letting it go. And it turned out that they were just lying. And they admitted that later. They said, we said it was fine so that the transfer would go through, but in reality, we're suspending all the things that we're doing. So they stopped the plan to allow people to go back to the north as a result of that. Um, and so the way they got out of that was negotiating another round of prisoner releases, prisoner exchanges midweek. Usually they happen at the end of the week. And so as a result of that, the Netzarim corridor was finally opened and people finally started going home. A site that, my goodness, I could watch every single one of those videos. Just, hundreds of thousands of people with whatever they have left going back to their homes, this sort of despite a year and a half of this genocide, despite all of the indignities that have been thrust not only upon them, but upon their homes in northern Gaza. And just, moments notice they're ready and going back, despite a lot of them being stranded in central Gaza for 2 days while they worked out this sort of, Israeli delay. Um, that gets us to, I think, the next round of releases. So the next round of prisoner exchanges will be tomorrow, where I think another three Israelis are going to be released in exchange for about 90 Palestinian prisoners. And alongside that, the reopening, ostensibly, we'll see, the reopening of the Rafah crossing. So, it's been closed ever since the Israeli assault on Rafah uh, mid last year. And Israel has confirmed that the plan right now is to reopen the Rafah crossing as part of the exchange tomorrow. So we should see by the end of the week Rafah being reopened, which is obviously for many reasons a huge deal, and hopefully will also be a really critical piece of the sort of humanitarian aid surge that's been happening lately. It's worth noting that Israel has on multiple occasions in the past week attempted to delay the implementation of different pieces of the ceasefire. There was that thing with Arbel Yahud, and then again with her, where when she was released, the Israelis described the scene of her release as being, quote, too chaotic. And because the handover was chaotic, and you can see photos of it on the left there were just a lot of people that showed up for that transfer thing. She was being guarded by a series of Qassam brigades people. So nothing happened to her, but she was crushed in by a crowd of a lot of people. And because of that, the Israelis once again delayed the implementation of some pieces of the agreement and then later went through with it. This is a thing we've been talking about for weeks now, that Israel would be trying to sort of push the boundaries of what's possible within the ceasefire arrangement to see what they can get away with. But, very importantly, the broader agreement stands. It hasn't really fallen apart yet. And I think that's really important on both sides of that, to reflect on the resilience of this agreement so far, the fact that phase one continues to sort of push through these obstacles, partly because I think, the US in particular is actually highly invested in making sure phase one of this agreement actually goes through, because Trump has his reputation on phase one. He's been trying to distance himself from phases two and three, but it's not inconceivable, right? That at least for this point, Trump is really trying to make sure that this goes through. So the sort of Israeli malfeasance isn't really being tolerated as a way to sort of scramble the process. I wanted to include this Twitter thread from Noura Arakat about, you know, talking about the Israeli claims about how, you know, Hamas isn't abiding by the ceasefire terms because the transfer was chaotic. And then she lays out all the different ways that Israel has violated the ceasefire in the past like week and a half. There are many, so it's worth checking it out. The prisoner exchange aspect of this, one thing that I wanted to note because we haven't really discussed it in past episodes is specifically how Israel is making it illegal for people to celebrate any Palestinians that are being released as a part of this exchange. So, despite the fact that obviously Israeli hostages are being returned to great fanfare and whatever, Palestinians are not allowed to celebrate the people who are being released. And 12 Palestinians have actually been arrested already, at least, for celebrating hostage releases. And these are Palestinians in, in the West Bank and in 48, right? Like in Jerusalem. Um, so, there are flyers that are being distributed specifically saying you're not allowed to like express joy about these people being released. And sure enough, Israel is picking up as many people as it's letting go. And this is a sort of standard operating procedure for them as well, where as soon as they release prisoners in exchange, they round up as many people as they possibly can, often to offset the number of people that they've let go. And they're using some things like this partly as an excuse there too. And then, in addition to like the sort of day-to-day implementation of this phase one of the ceasefire stuff, there's also this sort of ongoing Israeli destruction of infrastructure, which is continuing to happen. Just this week, Israel completely disabled the last remaining desalination plant operating in northern Gaza, a sign that, their attempt to sort of stay there and their expectations to stay there have really been wrecked. And so they're trying to like reduce the viability of that area as much as possible. And so this sort of jives, I think, with something that is being reported and only by a couple of news outlets, so I can't really confirm the veracity of this, but it's being reported that Steve Witkoff, the new Middle East envoy from Trump, has promised Netanyahu that the U.S. won't allow the reconstruction of Gaza until quote, the buffer zone is secured, meaning that, the new reality in Gaza guarantees Israel's safety. And what that means is like anybody's guess. It's very likely that this is sort of a nonsense statement that's designed to be as amorphous as possible and allow them to delay that um, basically indefinitely. And so there are expectations, or maybe concerns that this excuse of like waiting until the buffer zone is secured is basically Trump's way of uh, forcing the relocation of people in Gaza, right? As we know, he's been talking about this sort of ethnic cleansing idea of his. Well, it's not his idea, but he's very keen on the idea. Um, and like basically ensuring that as much of Gaza as possible remains unlivable for as long as possible as a way of forcing people out. uh, this is something that Trump's been talking about multiple times now, right? And he hasn't let that idea go. We talked about it in the last PSA as well, hoping that it would just sort of be something that he was saying off the cuff. But now it's been, to my count, I think 3 or 4 times that he's brought up the idea of what he calls cleaning out Gaza in his typical, like, despicable Nazi kind of language, uh, basically insisting that Egypt and Jordan take Palestinians out of Gaza. And he said like we're open to the idea of it being a temporary or a long-term basis, but we all know what that means. Uh, it's worth noting that despite the fact that Trump is clearly very keen on this idea and does clearly want it to happen, uh, it's not an easy thing to do. It's worth reminding folks that this was also a core demand of Israel back in October of 2023, when this sort of like escalation of the genocide started. And they immediately were like, okay, well, if you don't want Palestinians to die, you're going to have to let them out of Gaza. And uh, Egypt and Jordan are just highly, highly unwilling to do this. And, they have their own internal reasons for that. And I think not least among them is the idea that as sort of autocratic states. They don't want um, a group of people with a desire for like self-determination and not putting up with sort of fascist dictatorship uh, in their own countries, right? It's highly destabilizing. So they've already said there's absolutely no way that's going to happen. Whether or not it could still happen is a little bit hard to say. Uh, it's worth noting that no one else wants this, right? Like the rest of European countries and like whatever other states that are involved in this process are all wildly against this. Again, not on principle, not because they have better morals, but because they understand the sort of uh, effects to like geo stability, in the sort of medium to long term. But Trump does continue to double down on it. Just a couple days ago, again, he was asked by a reporter at his desk whether or not he thought it was realistic, given that Egypt and Jordan said absolutely not, and he said they're going to do it. They're going to do it. We do a lot for them, so they're going to do it. And it's worth noting that both of those countries are heavily dependent on U.S. aid. Jordan quite a bit, but Egypt very much. And again, worth noting that as we discussed right at the top, uh, Egypt is, the only country other than Israel that is still getting U.S. foreign aid, that hasn't been freezed in any meaningful way. And Egypt is in this sort of economic catastrophe right now where it's basically surviving on IMF loans and U.S. assistance. So, that those are powerful levers for the Trump administration to use. But I think Egypt understands the idea of letting Palestinians into Gaza as an existential crisis for the current government. So, like, even I don't know that they consider halting aid to be a worse outcome than letting in a large number of Palestinians from Gaza. It's also worth reflecting on the fact that this is uh, a death knell for Trump's normalization plans. That if this did actually go through, there's almost no way, right, that in a situation like that, that Saudi or some of these other countries that Trump is trying to get to normalize relationships with Israel would actually be able to go through. So again, I'm not super worried about it, but the fact that it's coming up a lot is something that, we should expect to see U.S. attempts to continue to keep Gaza unlivable. I think that is a very likely outcome. And that's something that we need to push really hard against and sort of, make sure that those plans are being transparent and that reconstruction is actually happening in a meaningful way. And it isn't allowed to sort of, you know, fritter away while people focus on other things. And one key piece of this, frankly, is what has been happening with UNRWA, which, we've discussed quite a bit on the PSAs and how Israel has declared it an illegal organization, uh, despite the fact that the UN is refusing to replace UNRWA with another agency, basically saying that no one else can do this work other than UNRWA. The UNRWA ban has now come into effect as of yesterday. So as of yesterday, UNRWA has had to close its Jerusalem offices. They are now banned from operating in Israel. That doesn't mean that they're banned from operating in Gaza, but for all intents and purposes, they don't really have any way of getting in or coordinating with the Israeli military if they're not allowed to speak to each other. So it's hard to overstate the impact that this is going to have on humanitarian distribution in Gaza. Um, and this is, coming on the heels of that bogus Israeli claim that there were a bunch of Hamas fighters that were part of UNRWA, which, they never ended up providing any evidence for. And, all these countries suspended donations to UNRWA. But since then, all of those countries have now resumed donations, and many of them have actually increased them. So Norway and Spain and a couple of other countries have upped their donations to UNRWA. The only people that have stopped it entirely is the United States. But that's obviously a huge chunk of their budget. And now, without being able to operate in Israel, it's not really clear what's going to be happening with UNRWA. And again, the UN, for a lot of reasons, is refusing to replace UNRWA with another organization, partly because like UNRWA is the only thing with the infrastructure to actually be providing this kind of aid, and partly because, you know, a member state of the United Nations can't just unilaterally dictate to the UN that, like, your agencies don't get to work the way that they want to work. So like somewhat on principle and then also logistically, operationally. Um, there's just a bit of a standoff now, and it's not. We'll know more in the next week, I think, what that's going to look like in terms of what UNRWA is able to do in Gaza or not. And I wanted to draw your attention to this article from Al Jazeera um, about what UNRWA's ban means by the numbers. And there's a series of really good charts in here that lays out everything that UNRWA has been doing and is responsible for doing. So I would definitely give that a look. It's a really they make it very easy to understand all the critical role that UNRWA has played in the past year and a half, but also more generally the importance of UNRWA as an institution supporting Palestinians in certain ways. Uh, and then, in addition to all the stuff that's been happening with UNRWA and the attempts by both the Trump administration and Israel to delegitimize it, we're also seeing some wild stuff about the U.S. government supposedly blocking $50 million worth of condoms going to Gaza, which Trump claimed were being used by Hamas to make bombs, which I don't think anybody here needs to know, like or suspects any differently. This is all obviously nonsense. Not only are condoms not being used to make weapons, but they're not being distributed by the U.S. government in Gaza at all. In fact, the United States doesn't distribute condoms in the Middle East, period. And if you take a step back and look more broadly, the United States distributes about $10 million worth of condoms globally. So the idea that there are $50 million worth of condoms is total nonsense, just absolutely made up, like God knows. And for a while, I was wondering where this could have come from and what it could mean because, obviously it's referencing something. Surely they didn't just make it up. And it turns out, as far as we can tell, and at least as far as I've been able to ascertain, there is an anti-AIDS program worth about $50 million that includes condom deliveries, but that's, a very small part of it. But it's an anti-AIDS program taking place in the Gaza province of Mozambique. And so I'm pretty sure that's what it actually is. And just once again, I think really goes to show the utter incompetence and stupidity of the people running the Trump administration. It's nice, I think to remind ourselves in the face of all of this abject horror and all of the insanely evil and horrible things that they're doing, that they're also just wildly incompetent. So it's nice to yeah, uh, remember that at least they're really bad at their campaign of whatever fascist global domination. Moving on to the West Bank, things there are largely the same as they were last week. We're seeing this like horrific assault on Jenin in particular, but not only in Jenin. The IDF is sort of attacking a number of areas in the West Bank. Um, uh, about 20 people or so have been killed in Jenin at least since the ceasefire has gone into effect, using a lot of tactics that we've seen in Gaza. And, again, this is a thing we talked about last week where the IDF has been very open about saying we're using the lessons learned from Gaza in the West Bank. And sure enough, yes, like this attacks on hospitals, the mass detentions, the sexual humiliation, we're seeing all of that um, in the exact same format in the West Bank, where dynamics are obviously very different, but the Gaza playbook is clearly there. And uh, it now sounds like, somewhat unsurprisingly, that the new defense minister, Israel Katz, is saying that the IDF is going to stay in Jenin indefinitely, quote, to ensure that terror doesn't return, whatever the hell that means. So the same sort of idea that they were doing in northern Gaza of just sort of occupying it as long as they can possibly occupy it seems to be happening in the West Bank as well. And this is coming at the same time that some members of the Knesset have drafted a bill about what they're calling Orwellian in their Orwellian speak, the elimination of discrimination in the purchase of real estate in Judea and Samaria, which basically just means that Israeli settlers can purchase whatever land they want in the West Bank, including like in the middle of Palestinian cities, in whatever areas that Palestinians ostensibly have sovereignty over on, these sort of dead Oslo Accords. So the annexation plans in the West Bank are clearly in full effect and accelerating in many ways. Um, yeah, there's a lot about what's happening in Jenin, but yeah, I'd recommend folks just read a little bit about that. There are many different moving pieces there. In Lebanon, last week we said that the initial terms of the ceasefire were expiring on Sunday, and sure enough, when that day came, the United States basically unilaterally declared that the ceasefire terms were going to be extended for another few weeks to February 18th, I think. Um, and this is despite the fact that Hezbollah put out a statement, and, like had their new chief basically say that this is totally unacceptable to us. And there's no reason for that delay. And the agreement was troops had to withdraw within 60 days, and they should be withdrawing within 60 days. It seems that the United States tried to do a 1 month extension, like out to February 28th, and then negotiated it down to February 18th, basically giving Israel an extra 18 days to withdraw its troops from southern Lebanon. But like, I'm not particularly optimistic that Israel will be going anywhere in 18 days, and they can easily just do this extension again. And in fact, I suspect that they will. And I wouldn't be surprised if we ended up in a situation where because the US is just allowing Israel to do whatever it wants, and the US is supposed to be the broker of this ceasefire agreement, that's just going to keep happening until things just flare back up again. Um, and I think, neither side is really in a position to like resume a hot war. So that's why I think things are allowed to sort of, stumble along this way, but that's not a sustainable political dynamic. And I think that will change eventually one way or another. In the meantime, what we did see when the ceasefire original term expired on Sunday was uh, a really remarkable scene of thousands of Lebanese going back to their villages, despite the fact that the Israelis were still there, and basically demanding that they be let back into their homes. And that resulted in some really horrific violence on the part of the IDF, where 20 some odd, I think 24 Lebanese people were killed. I know this slide says 22. Um, and wounding hundreds more as people just sort of walked back into their villages despite the presence of the IDF there. And there's this remarkable clip that I included here of a woman just standing in front of a tank, refusing to let it move, as she demands to be let back into her homes. And these are homes that have been utterly destroyed, and it doesn't matter, in a sort of beautiful parallel to what was happening in Gaza, where all of those people were returning to the north. The Lebanese folks were returning to the south, basically to rebuild upon the rubble of their homes. Like this idea that despite all the might and the horror and the violence of the Israeli occupations, like nothing stops people from returning to their land. And that was, quite a moment, I think, for all of us to reflect on. In Syria, less less exciting things. We've got two big things that happened this week. Neither of which is particularly surprising. They were both sort of inevitable, so we were just waiting for them to happen, and they did finally happen. On the one hand, uh, Ahmed al-Shar'a, the formerly known Mohammed al-Julani, head of the HTS uh, armed rebel group, has declared himself president. He's been acting as a de facto president for the past few weeks anyway. But in doing so, he had to suspend the Constitution, obviously, because you can't just declare yourself president based on the existing Constitution. So he suspended the Constitution, disbanded the army and all opposition parties, including his own. So Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the HTS armed group, technically no longer exists. It's been disbanded by the state. And so now the idea is that according to him, they're going to be drafting a new constitution and holding elections. And those elections are supposed to happen 4 years from now. But the constitution is supposed to be drawn up 3 months from now. So things are a little wonky there. Declaring himself president sort of makes sense, given that he has to engage with other world leaders and like whatever. So, he needs some sort of title, but it's not a good sign. Obviously, not a great sign. And speaking of not good signs, this Israeli incursion into southern Syria, where they took Mount Hernon, and then not only the UN buffer zone past the Golan Heights, But then beyond the UN buffer zone, Israel said it was a limited and temporary thing to secure its borders. And now, surprise, surprise, actually, they're saying they're going to remain there indefinitely, using some vague language about like not allowing enemies to amass near Israel's border or something like that. Mount Hermon is the highest elevation point in the region, right? So it overlooks everything, Damascus, Tel Aviv, Beirut, and is obviously strategically valuable for anyone to occupy that. And so it's not super surprising that the Israelis want to keep it. It's a nice way to keep an eye on and sort of protect the other piece of Syria that they had previously illegally annexed. And so, yeah, it's grim, and there doesn't seem to be anyone or anything willing to stop them from doing that. So they'll be there for, yeah, until they're forced to leave. Meanwhile, in the United States, probably the big news, of course, is Trump's new executive order threatening to cancel the visas of pro-Palestinian protesters. Uh, a terrifying, terrifying development. It's really hard to overstate how scary this is. It's obviously unconstitutional. It violates some pretty basic constitutional free speech provisions that not that that's ever stopped Trump before. Uh, but there are a lot of pieces in here that, like regardless, it's being fought in the courts and stuff, regardless of whether this actually goes through and it does what it intends to do. And I do think it'll be hard for Trump to actually succeed in pulling off the mass deportation of students who are involved in Palestine protests. That may or may not actually be the point. There's clearly an attempt here to just sort of stifle speech on Palestine and to make the cost of people speaking up on Palestine higher. And that's obviously working, right? Like if I was an international student right now, I'd be scared about talking about Palestine publicly. Um, and so, adding that fear and stifling free speech is clearly a key part of this agenda right now. But also buried within it are a series of provisions that are sort of designed to increase the repressive apparatus of the state generally as it relates to, you know, ostensibly Palestine organizing, but clearly this is meant to be used more broadly over time. And so there's a piece buried in that executive order that talks about basically encouraging universities, not mandating, mind you, but encouraging universities to spy on their students and report activities that the government considers to be like anti-Israel to the government. So basically turning universities into ways of like spying on students, and monitoring their social media activity and things like that. So a terrifying and really worrying development. And I'm sure a lot of universities are just going to line up and do it, despite the fact that they don't even have to. So pressure on universities to not do this is really critical. And in moments like this, I think it's really important to reflect on like, what the sensationalist headline is, but then what the actual plan of what they're trying to implement will be, and then what a strategic response is to that actual plan. And so like instead of, like um, running around being terrified about the deportation stuff, although we should be, right? Um, a key piece here is pressuring the universities not to go along with the sort of um, suggested reporting of student activities to the government, which no university should be doing, obviously. Another piece of this, and this article was like the biggest roller coaster I've read in a really long time. If you read one thing from the articles this week, it should probably be this one. Talking about this cyber intelligence AI firm that basically is working with the Trump administration to dox Palestine protesters and like, de-anonymize them. It's got some AI tool that can look through kafiyas or some shit. And so the idea is that they're gonna like find people who spoke out on Palestine and report them to the government for deportation. And they're doing this in coordination with this group called Bitar, which is a self-described right-wing Zionist youth movement that it's actually existed for a really long time. It goes back to the founding of Israel. They describe themselves, Bitar describes themselves on the website as I have the quote here, active instigators of disturbance and violence, frequently bombing Arab civilian areas. Like like they were a terrorist group in, mandate Palestine before the establishment of the Israeli state. Working really closely with the Irgun, like with it's a whole Menachem Begin thing. Um, but that group, they're organizing this. I put this, Twitter thing that they put up. It's the 1 year anniversary of Hind Rajab's death, and they are, they threatened to go to the rally where people were mourning the death of this 5-year-old, so that they could like take pictures of people and report them to ICE. So there's a lot here, and it's all really kind of horrific and kind of gross. There's a weird aside about the founder of this like AI group. It's called Stellar Defense or something. Stellar Defense and Cyber Intelligence. And the person who runs it is a guy named Eliyahu Hawila, who it turns out has been lying about his identity for all of these years, including to his wife. And it turns out that Eliyahu Hawila, who claimed to be like an Orthodox Jewish guy, is actually a Shia Muslim from southern Lebanon named Ali Hassan. Like, it's a crazy story. You should definitely read this article. But yeah, the repression stuff is very real and very concerning, and I think will require like a broad community effort to push back against it. On the international stage, uh, we talked last week about how the selection of the president of the International Court of Justice as the new president of Lebanon means that the vice president of the ICJ, who was the one person, the judge from Uganda, who voted against Israel's illegal occupation court decision, she is now the president. We talked about how much that would suck. And we've discovered this week that in her dissenting opinion on that case about the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza and Jerusalem, that she plagiarized her dissenting opinion from like a bunch of just like nutty right-wing sources, including basically a word for word paragraph taken out of some PragerU thing about how Palestine doesn't exist, and then also a bunch of like Douglas Feith and other just really garbage sources, just in a way that is shockingly poorly done. I doubt there will be any consequences of this, unfortunately, but good to know that this person who stinks is also kind of a dummy. On the ICC side, there's this article about this fascinating lawsuit that an Israeli lawyer who currently lives in Paris has filed, basically taking a different tack than the other cases that have been moved forward, including the ICJ genocide case, where he was like, okay, it's harder to prove genocide, so this is a case alleging incitement to genocide, and basically looking at all the statements that Israeli officials have made aimed at dehumanizing Palestinians and clearing the way for these sort of genocidal actions. And all those quotes are included in this article, of course. It's interesting because this guy actually filed a lawsuit 10 years ago against Yoav Gallant, back when he was a general, the former Israeli defense minister. And in that lawsuit from 10 years ago, he was like, I know the Israeli courts are going to kick out this lawsuit, and that's too bad because like unless they start to grapple with the war crimes that they're committing, sooner or later the lawsuit's going to be at The Hague. And sure enough, here it is at The Hague. So he was right. Meanwhile, the other ICC implication this week was that Netanyahu, who was scheduled to go to the Auschwitz commemoration ceremony um, on Tuesday in Poland, decided not to attend because he was worried he was going to be arrested. And this is despite the fact that Poland specifically said that he could attend. So the government said, like, we won't arrest you if you come. There was enough concern that, something might happen that he would, in fact, get arrested, that he decided not to go or felt like he couldn't go. And, coming just a few days after he openly, publicly defended a person doing a Nazi salute on national television, I think is a very fitting rejection of his ability to go commemorate, the victims of fascism. So, to sum up, the ceasefire agreement remains extremely fragile, but it is holding. And this is despite the fact that Israel is really prodding its limitations and seeing what it can get away with. Nevertheless, the ceasefire does appear to be holding in phase one. Whether or not it'll move into phase two is something we'll know a lot more about next week, because by next week those negotiations should have started, and so we'll start to get a sense um, of what is being said about the actual withdrawal of Israeli troops from Gaza. Um, Meanwhile, I would say the overall fate of Gazans remains very much in the air, given the sort of very clearly delineated ethnic cleansing ambitions of Trump and the Israeli state, which are, remain unrealistic, but not inconceivable. And again, I think the key route by which they will do this is simply um, preventing Gaza from restoring itself, right? Like to make the conditions there so unlivable um, that people have no choice but to leave. But uh, yeah, there a lot hinges on that, including how much political will can be put towards forcing things to move in a different direction. And then West Bank and Lebanon continuing to be flashpoints, at least for the next few weeks, while the IDF continues to do things in Jenin. And we'll see what's happening with this sort of collapsing ceasefire in Lebanon. And then here in the United States, attempts to silence the Palestine movement are very much in full swing. We are now feeling it. We knew it was coming. Now it's here. That's not to say that more isn't coming, but it's really critical that we formulate thoughtful strategic defenses to what is happening, and that we don't let this movement silence us and silence the demands for Palestinian freedom and liberation and dignity. And by continuing to speak, even in the face of this repression, is how we fight it. Because if it succeeds in silencing us, they will be emboldened and they will do more. But if this attempt fails, that allows us to continue to fight against them, right? And to fight against this larger fascist project. It's not only about Palestine, but speaking about Palestine is the way to keep the door open to speaking out against fascism generally. And that's a really critical thing for us. And then some upcoming events. There's an event in Berkeley tonight at the La Peña Cultural Center about big tech's complicity in genocide and apartheid. The founder of Hamle, an amazing Palestinian organization, will be there. And then on Sunday, CARE is hosting a dinner for Latifah Simon, California's first ever Muslim member of Congress, who has spoken very clearly about making sure that the genocide stays on the agenda and being a defender of Palestinian rights and freedom. So would really encourage folks to go there. I will be there. Would love to see you there. And then if you want to know about more events that are coming up, please check out the AROC calendar at bit.ly/Gaza events or from the AROC website. If you want text alerts, please text PSA to 833-633-0604. And if you want more information on the articles that inform this analysis, please check out the PAL Media Tracker at palmediatracker.com. You can sign up at palmediatracker.com/signup. And that's the end of it. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, Samer. I really appreciate it. I think if the point is to confuse and overwhelm us, then these PSAs are certainly a solve to help us to sort through the mess. And so appreciate you helping us break it down. A couple of announcements for folks before everyone goes. I'm going to drop a link in the chat. CPE and Bay Resistance will be hosting an event on Monday, February 10th. Ya Basta, Lessons from the Northern California Coalition for Immigrant Rights with Mujeres Unidas y Activas to talk a little bit about with some veteran organizers around the origins of the sanctuary movement and some lessons to apply to the fight against mass deportation today. So encourage you all to check that out and to attend that. And we'll stick around a little bit. I also want to just make another plug. As you know, these PSAs are, we rely on community support. And so if folks can make a donation, if you find these helpful, we would really appreciate that. And yeah, we'll stick around for a little while, play some music and answer some of the questions in